Edie's reputation at school is starting to fall apart when her accusations against Bryce go nowhere. Unfortunately, Edie's got bigger problems when her body is literally falling apart and the only thing that keeps it together is meat, even if it's still alive. It gets pretty gross, and we're going to talk about it in our review of Edie number 3 from Blood Moon Comics. See you in 3. And welcome back to Comical Opinions. This is our review of Edie number 3 from Blood Moon Comics. And in this issue, Edie finds her body falling apart, and the only thing that can keep it together is meat. And it doesn't even matter if it's still moving around. So it's getting pretty gross out there. But before we get started, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit that bell for notification. Your attention is greatly appreciated. And stay tuned to the end for the rating and score. So let's talk about the credits. Edie number 3 is written by Paul Catalanato. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Art by Greg Warrenchak. Colors by Rebecca Good. Letters by Buddy Bodine or Baudouin. Not sure about that one either. And the cover is also by Greg Warrenchak. So let's recap what happened in the last issue. Edie was feeling kind of gross and disgusted on 2 levels. First, she reported the sexual assault by Bryce to the school administration. After a lengthy series of interviews and investigation, it turned into a he said, she said scenario, and effectively the investigation went nowhere. Even though her parents were very upset, Taylor, her best friend, was very upset, but the rest of the school, because they're all on the side of Bryce and all the mean girls and all the mean jocks, they all stuck with Bryce. And now basically the entire school is against Edie and a little bit against Taylor as well for sticking up for her friend. At the same time, Edie's body, now merged or morphed or consumed by the green goo she touched at the end of the first issue, is starting to ooze and fall apart a little bit. At the very last moment, when she thinks she's sick and completely gross and doesn't know what's going on, her mother tries to check on her, and her body instinctively lashes out and eats and consumes her mother. And for a girl that's already going through a traumatic experience, it can't get much worse from there. So that was what happened in the last issue. Now let's talk about what happened in this issue. What she finds is, after effectively eating her mother and absorbing her mother into her body, that sort of puts her body back together, and she is able to still kind of commune with her mother's consciousness. The body's gone, but the mind is still there, and so she can hear her mother's thoughts, consoling her, still trying to be a nurturing mother, and seeing what Edie went through after her, during and after her assault from Bryce. And so the mother is now consoling her, trying to give her comfort and reason, and maybe even giving her a little bit of advice what to do. But at the same time, Edie is now completely horrified that her mother is effectively dead, and she has eaten her, and her body is starting to stretch out and try to latch on anything that is meat related, whether it's alive, dead, it doesn't matter. In school, because Edie is staying out of school because she's sick and doesn't want to be around anybody, in school, Taylor is getting the ire and the wrath of all the mean girls and all the friends and all the jocks that surround Bryce. And they start toilet papering her car, calling her nasty names behind her back, and tensions are starting to rise in the school. When Edie finally reaches out to Taylor saying, hey, why don't you come on over? I could use a friend. Bring a lot of hamburger meat and fries, and we'll watch some movies and whatever and just relax. Taylor shows up. The house is pretty dark, or at least all the shades are drawn and all the lights are out. And she sees Edie attack all the hamburgers and the french fries and all the food she brought by just simply her body reaching out with tentacles and all kinds of non-human appendages and just absorbs it into her body. And what she sees is that her face starts to come back together a little bit, but not a whole lot. And then just on pure instinct, Edie's arms and appendages lash out and absorb her cat when it comes by, Mr. Whiskers. And that is enough to kind of bring her face back together. Taylor's freaking out, Edie's freaking out, and her body now starts to move towards Taylor, even though Edie consciously doesn't want her friend to get eaten or killed. Neither does Taylor, of course. The body is just constantly searching out for anything that's alive, that's meat-based, and she's trying to hold back, and Taylor eventually takes off. But she says she's not going to tell anybody, and she says you got to get help. Later, Edie decides to go undercover, not undercover, but incognito to a supermarket, and she starts absorbing everything in the meat aisle, and unfortunately accidentally starts absorbing members or employees and anybody who's customers or patrons of the supermarket. And body-wise, Edie's just starting to come apart and become more alien and more grotesque. And it reminds you, initially it was meant to be sort of an homage to the Blob, but now it's starting to become a mixture of the Blob and the Thing, at least John Carpenter's version of the Thing, where her body can now split and pieces of her are conscious, but it's all tentacles and appendages and just anything that can latch onto that's meat-based, so she can absorb it and come back together while she's in a constant state of hunger. And it gets really gross, really disgusting. Not sure where it's headed, but at least, but things are escalating, and that's the key here. Things are escalating. So I mentioned 2 movies, just an interesting factoid. Is it really more like the Blob, or is it more like the Thing? It's a little bit of both. The idea that you have this sort of alien creature blob mass that's trying to consume everything in sight. It's not trying to consume everything, it's trying to consume everything that's meat. So there's an organic component, there's a little bit of a twist, and that's where you get the Blob homage or the Blob parallel. It also, at the same time, has a lot of parallels to the Thing in that she's conscious, she's aware, and when your body's splitting apart and right down the middle, on the sides, appendages are moving off in separate directions, and it very much feels like the cellular type of organism that you saw in John Carpenter's The Thing. So it's a little bit of mix with both. Now, what do we think about this issue? What do we think about Edie number 3? I think this is one of the stronger issues in the series. What we were hoping for in the beginning, when we started to see where it was going with Edie when she first came in contact with this alien goo, is that once you figured out who were the bad people and who were the people that kind of deserved it, the mother was surprised because she's a good person. But you very quickly established that you have all these bad kids at school. You knew they were going to get what was coming to them. This feels like the energy's picking up, the momentum is picking up, and though that you get what you deserve moments are finally coming, and they're coming pretty quickly. However, there is also a second layer where there's a layer of tragedy, specifically because Edie ate her mother when she didn't want to, and that Edie is trying desperately to stay in control and she can't. So there's a level of tragedy to the story that makes it a little bit more emotionally deep in a surprising way that you don't quite expect. So lots of gross out horror, but also there's a strong emotional moment to it that really kind of plays up the tragic elements of what Edie's experienced, because she's spiraling out of control and she's powerless to do anything to stop it. And I will also say, as a third point for why we like this issue, is it improves on the previous issues, primarily because a lot of the time was spent dwelling on the mean kids at school and how terrible they are, and the sexual assault and the investigation. A lot of those elements, there was a lot of time spent on those elements and very little time trying to witness what was happening to Edie from the alien blob that essentially subsumed or consumed her body and took it over. So there was an imbalance between two stories that seemed to be working against each other. In this issue, the horror story half takes center stage. The background pieces are there with Bryce and all the mean girls. That's all there, but it's more like a secondary or a B plot where the two appear to be on a collision course to intersect. So this issue, I think, is the strongest of the three so far, because it's a horror story. You want the horror element to take center stage, and it does that in this issue. What didn't really like about the issue, I think, generally speaking, not a whole lot, although Edie, when she's starting to realize what's happening to her, didn't think that maybe Taylor would be in danger. They're supposed to be the best of friends. They're supposed to be the closest of friends, and yet she intentionally invites her over to help her out, knowing she would put Taylor in danger, which she already recalled and was horrified by what happened to her mother. So there's no way she would be more or less in control with Taylor than she was with her mother. So that whole scenario didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. She might call her up and say, "Hey, can you get me a bunch of food and leave it at the door?" Okay, that I can understand, but to invite her inside knowing she can't control herself, that just didn't seem to kind of sit logically. And so that felt a little bit off. But everything else was pretty on point for a story of this nature and where the series kind of wants you to go. So let's talk about the art for a second. Greg Warrencheck really leans into the body horror aspects in this issue more than the first two, and so you get a lot of the weird tentacles and body splitting and all kinds of green goo gross out. There's even a sequence where half of Edie's face falls off, and it's human on one side and this sort of green skeleton melty part on the other side, and it looks great for exactly this kind of reason, or at least for this kind of story that you want. Is her just wandering around trying to kind of keep herself together psychologically and emotionally, but physically it's a nightmare, and that's exactly the kind of stuff you want to see in this type of story. So final thoughts. What do we think about Edie number 3 from Blood Moon Comics? More gross out horror, which is what we want. There's a tragic element that gives it some emotional depth, which works really very well in the story's favor. And the art showing all the gross out horror elements is pretty on point. The only downside really is that weird logic gap where Edie invites her friend over to help her out, knowing that she would be in danger. That didn't seem to make sense, but other than that minor plot disconnect, everything else I think was pretty strong. So therefore, we're going to give Edie number 3 from Blood Moon Comics a solid 8.5 out of 10. We hope you like this review, and if you want to hear more just like this one, please stay tuned to the outro.